Hi, my name is Barry Setterfield. Welcome to this presentation on the Christmas star. Christmas is surrounded with traditions of various sorts. Often they have very little basis in reality. What we're doing in these sessions is looking at the data that we have from astronomy, from history and from the Bible and putting it all together, and we find the story that comes out of that is far more interesting than just from the traditions alone. This presentation is primarily in two parts. The first part deals with the wise men and the birth and history and associated matters. The second part deals with data from astronomy and what the star actually was. Throughout this presentation we have Julie Kennedy from Freedom Films reading these scripture portions to us. Freedom Films produced the original DVD on the Christmas star, and we are deeply grateful to them for this session. So, let us start this session with Julie reading something from Luke chapter 2 to get us started.
So it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, every one to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered.
Luke says the birth occurred when Quirinius was first governor of Syria. Quirinius was also known as Cyrenius. Historically, we know that Senator P. Sulpicius Quirinius was governor of Syria twice. The first time was for 5 years, from 6 BC to 1 BC. In 1 BC he became advisor to Gaius Caesar. Then he was governor again from 6 AD to 7 or 8 AD. So Jesus' birth is narrowed down immediately to somewhere between 6 and 1 BC. But we need a more specific date to find the timing of the Christmas star. Caesar Augustus was Roman emperor at this time, as Luke says. During the same 5-year period, 6 to 1 BC, 3 key events took place in Roman history. The first is that the year 2 BC marked the 750th year since Rome was founded. The second is that same year, 2 BC, was also the 25th year of the reign of Augustus. The third key event involves the census, enrolment, or registration. On the 5th of February 2 BC, Augustus was given the highest honour for any Roman. He was awarded the title Pater Patriae, or Father of the Country. Previously, Augustus had told the Roman Senate he would not accept the title offered him unless Roman citizens from all parts of the empire agreed to it. For this purpose, an enrolment had to take place before Augustus could be given the title. The decree of Augustus for the enrolment to occur is given in full in an inscription in this temple in Paphlagonia, Turkey. Here is part of Augustus' decree within that temple. It is known as the Res Gestae inscription of Augustus from the title at the top. The inscription dates to the end of 3 BC. This marks the time when the registration was completed. Some of our Bibles say that this was a census. It was not so much a census. Rather, it was a registration or enrolment. The following quote comes from The Census under Quirinius by Paul R. Finch. He explains what happened.
Luke says the enrollment involved the entire Roman world, which made it different from registrations done locally for tax purposes. There was evidence found in the Paphlagonia inscription dated 3 BC that an oath of allegiance was taken by the inhabitants, and that the same oath was taken by all the people in the land. On the 25th anniversary of his reign, Caesar Augustus himself wrote that while I was administering my 13th consulship, the Senate and the Equestrian Order, and the entire Roman people, gave me the title Father of my Country. When Caesar accepted this title on February 5th, 2 BC, the oath and registration had already been conducted and completed the year before.
Mary and Joseph were directly involved in the registration for an additional reason. Augustus required everyone with any royal connections throughout the empire to declare that they would not attempt to usurp the throne. Since Mary and Joseph were both from the line of King David, who had ruled Israel, they both had to make declarations. This was important as the extent of David's kingdom was significant and is shown in purple on this map. Rome had to fight for this same area to claim it some 40 years earlier, so Joseph and Mary's declaration was vital. We know the date when the registration was held from several sources. Information confirms that the oath was taken throughout the entire Roman Empire in late summer or early autumn of 3 BC. We know this process had to be completed by the end of 3 BC, as Augustus received his title on the 5th of February in 2 BC. This gives us a strong indication that Jesus was born sometime in 3 BC. We have an additional cross-check from the fact that Herod was ruling Judea as a puppet of Rome when Jesus was born. Remember that Herod asked the wise men when the star appeared. They responded that the star had first appeared just 2 years earlier, so the date of Herod's death will then be the latest date for the wise men to see him. Herod's hilltop tomb is shown here. Josephus, the Jewish historian, records that Herod died shortly after an eclipse of the moon and was buried with all the ritual well before Passover that year. Josephus also records that shortly before the eclipse, Herod had ordered the execution of a number of rabbis and 40 others. Thus it was written that the eclipsed moon was, quote, red with the blood of the murdered rabbis, end quote. The moon never turns red during a partial eclipse. It requires a full eclipse for the moon to take on that red colour. At a partial eclipse it is still grey. Yet some historians take a partial eclipse in mid-March of 4 BC as being the one. But the moon was not red on that occasion. Further, there is not enough time for all the recorded events to occur and burial rites to be performed before Passover. When all the evidence is put together, only one eclipse out of the 4 fits the requirements. It was the full eclipse of the moon on the 9th of January, 1 BC. This is confirmed by 2 facts. A 1st century Jewish holiday celebrated Herod's death on the 24th of January, the 2nd of Shabbat, in 1 BC. Second, early Christian historians and writings agreed with this timing. That means the wise men must have seen Herod before that date. Therefore, the star had to have appeared 2 years earlier. If we backtrack 2 years from 1 BC, the date of 3 BC again becomes important as the time of the first appearance of the star. This is also the same year as the registration or census of Augustus, so we suspect the birth may have occurred in 3 BC. As to the time of the year, Luke gives us some important information.
Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And all those who heard it marveled at those things which were told them by the shepherd.
Luke tells us that when the birth occurred, shepherds were in the fields watching their flocks by night. This means it must have been lambing time. If sheep were in the sheepfolds at night at lambing time, the lambs could be trampled and injured or killed. Therefore, since spring and fall were the two lambing seasons, the shepherds would keep their sheep out of the folds and in the fields instead. In that way they could keep watch for predators as well as for ewes having trouble birthing. So we conclude that Jesus was born either in the spring or the fall of 3 BC. However, a Mideast correspondent pointed out it is usual for flocks to be in the fields at night, only in autumn after the harvest is brought in. At this time the sheep can eat the stubble and residual grain. This is a boon to the farmers, as the sheep droppings also fertilise the fields for the later planting. In spring, the sheep would trample the new plants, so the conclusion is that the biblical statement strongly implies it was autumn. It is of interest to note that the lambs from Bethlehem's fields were used in temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. In Bethlehem, when those lambs were being born, Messiah, the Lamb of God, was born, who is to make a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Since history tells us that the registration of Augustus occurred in the late summer and early autumn, we suspect that Mary gave birth in the autumn. Indeed, Luke states that she was great with child when they arrived at Bethlehem for the census. But there are other indications that the autumn was the time of Jesus' birth because of Mary's cousin Elizabeth and her husband Zacharias. First, some ancient history. About 1,000 years earlier, King David organised the priestly schedules into 24 courses or times of serving each year. Each priest served one course annually. In Luke 1, we read that Zacharias belonged to the division of Abia or Abijah. Those priests served the 8th course. That's marked with a star here. After accounting for the interruption of Passover and the Feast of Weeks, Zacharias served during June. During his service this particular year, the angel Gabriel promised a child for Zacharias' barren wife, Elizabeth. If we assume she became pregnant shortly after Zacharias arrived home from his temple duties, she conceived late in June. A full-term delivery would have been the following spring. Luke tells us that Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant when Mary came to visit her. That would have been in late December, and we are told Mary had just conceived when she visited Elizabeth. This means that Mary's conception took place in winter. She stayed with Elizabeth 3 months, probably until Elizabeth's son John was born, and then went home. When we put everything together, we know for sure that Mary did not give birth in the spring, but rather in the autumn of 3 BC. This gives us the year and the season. But can we get somewhat closer, say the month or perhaps even the day? A hint on this may be given in a passage from Revelation, but we need some background first. In this presentation, we'll be speaking about several star groups or constellations. Today we often see elaborate figures drawn around these star groups, but the ancients seemed to draw stick figures by connecting the starry dots. When done this way, Leo the lion really does look like a lion, and Gemini the twins is well represented by stick figures as shown here. There is more about this and other details in our YouTube session on star stories. As the Earth travels around the Sun in its orbit, we get different groups of stars which appear to be behind the Sun at different times of the year, as shown here. The apparent path of the Sun through the star groups is called the zodiac, from the Greek word zoad, meaning a way, a step, or a path. We often describe this effect by saying the Sun is in Pisces or the Sun is in Capricorn. The 12 groups of stars or constellations in the path of the Sun has been recognised from ancient times and throughout history. From antiquity and still today, one constellation the Sun passes through is called the Woman in Heaven, or Virgo. It was referred to this way in Isaiah 7:14, long before the birth of Jesus. In the book of Revelation 12:1, we read that at the time Messiah was born, the woman in heaven was clothed with the sun and had the moon at her feet. This gives us very exact timing, because back then the sun was in Virgo in September. The moon at her feet meant the moon was in the same star group as the sun. That is to say, it was new moon, in this case the September new moon. Now, a real new moon cannot be seen except through a telescope. It takes 2 nights for the sliver to be visible to the naked eye in the sunset. The September new moon in 3 BC started astronomically on the 10th. It was first visible on the 12th in 3 BC. If Jesus was born that day and circumcised on his 8th day in accord with Jewish law, then he shed his first blood on the Day of Atonement, September the 20th of 3 BC. 5 days later, on the 25th, the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles started. At that festival, people construct and dwell in tents or booths covered with palm branches. There is a further link here with the Gospel of John, which tends to confirm all this. In John 1:14, a check with the original language reveals that, in describing the coming of Messiah, he states that, quote, "The Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us." This is a fascinating hint that Jesus had been born and was now dwelling with us around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. At the time of Tabernacles, all males were required to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. This feast, Tabernacles, may not be the precise date of Jesus' birth, but it does indicate he was born about this general time. It means we can be reasonably sure that he was born between 10th and the 25th of September 3 BC. If that is true, there is the intriguing possibility that his conception was quite close to December 25 the previous year, if not that exact date. We will also come to 2 other reasons why 25th of December is an important date in part 2. So we know almost exactly when Jesus was born by looking at the Bible, historical data, as well as Augustus and Herod. In discussing the birth of Messiah, one other matter may be important. It concerns translations and what actually occurred. In Luke 2, in the King James Version, the KJV, we have the comment that there was, quote, "no room in the inn." In the New International Version, the NIV, and others, it is not inn, but guest rooms, guest quarters, or guest chambers. These are a more correct translation of the Greek of Luke 2. The Greek word for inn or public lodging is pandokion. This is not the word used in the Greek of Luke 2. Rather, Luke 2 uses kataluma, meaning guest room. The KJV, the King James Version, gave rise to the Christmas tradition shown here, that Joseph and Mary were refused accommodation in a public lodging place and were given an animal shelter instead. Well, what is this passage actually saying? Here is a typical Mideastern house. It has a kataluma or guest room. Indeed, it was a cause of shame and deep embarrassment if there was not a guest room, and visiting relatives had to be sent to some commercial lodging instead. The problem was that hundreds of people, who were all from David's lineage, were crowding into Bethlehem at this time. All the guest rooms in relative houses were full. In this patriarch's house, the guest room was the upper room up the stairs to the right. Note the storage area included the manger through the door at left centre. Now here is something which is often missed. When a Jewish woman gives birth, she is considered to be ritually unclean. Further, anyone who touches her would be unclean also. But this was the season of major religious celebrations for the Jewish community. The Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles. they had to be clean to partake in the feasts. If Mary gave birth in the house, the entire house and its occupants would be denied participation in the religious celebrations, such as the modern one shown here, as they would be considered ritually unclean. So here was the problem they all faced. The guest rooms are full, but a heavily pregnant girl needed shelter. Let us come in obliquely on the answer to the problem. Today, we have garages for our cars, which are our means of transportation, and the garage is attached to the house. But when the square footage of the house is considered, the garage is not included. Back then, their transportation, their horses, their donkeys, etc., were valuable and had to be stabled in the lowest sector of the house, as in this example. Just like today, that area was not included when considering the house itself. If the house was built over a cave, as some were, the animals were housed in the cave. The feeding trough and manger were easily accessible from the interior of the house. Because the stable or manger were not considered to be part of the living quarters, Mary could be there and the house still be clean. So the stable was cleaned out, and there Mary gave birth. The baby was wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in one of the feeding troughs in the manger. As the Bible recounts, it was there that the shepherds found the family. Let us now change the pace and focus of our attention. We look at the years 3 and 2 BC to find out what was going on in the east, that is, east of Judea and the borders of the Holy Land. Again, we turn to the biblical record, this time from the book of Matthew, chapter 2, and the account of the wise men.
Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel.
Who were these wise men, and what were they looking for? Remember, Matthew said they came from the east, that is, east of Judea. Judea at that time was a buffer state between the sprawling Roman Empire in the west and the fabulous Persian Empire of the Parthian dynasty in the east. As shown here, the Persian Empire at that time extended from eastern Turkey through Mesopotamia to the Indus River in India. The Parthian dynasty controlled the ancient Silk Route, which went via India across to China, half a world away. The merchants who travelled this route could only trade with the approval of the Persians. Persia then became famous for all of the items traded from this route with countries to the west, including Rome. Archaeologists have found hand-worked items like these made of gold and precious stones. They are typical of items traded from that route at that time. More generally, the Persians traded in precious metals, gems, rugs, silks, and incense. The wise men came from this empire and had access to all these items of trade. Please remember that the Bible lists 3 types of gifts they brought to honour the baby: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It never says there were only 3 wise men. But why should any of them be interested in a baby born in a neighbouring country? Historically, and from the Bible, we know that there was a time when the nation of Judah was captured and went into exile in Babylonia. One of the young men taken captive was Daniel. The Bible records he became the chief authority in the entire court during the reign of several kings. When the Persians conquered Babylon, Daniel was made head of the court during the reign of Cyrus and Darius. In his later years he served in this palace. Here is the reconstruction of part of that palace. Daniel's position meant he was not only head counselor, but also head astronomer as well. Because of his position, Daniel's prophecies became part of the Persian court records, which were available to all later astronomers. In addition, Arab astronomer Abulfaragius, quoted by eminent Orientalist Professor Thomas Hyde, asserted that there was a student in the court at that time named Zoroaster. When Daniel gave the prophecies, Zoroaster noted them. This is why the religious system that Zoroaster founded included some of Daniel's prophecies. At the time of Jesus' birth, Zoroastrianism was over 440 years old and was the state religion in Persia. This situation continued for over 220 years after Jesus' birth. Some follow it today. The writings of this religion, the Zend-Avesta, contained a prophecy based on Daniel's work that there would be born unto the Jews a king Messiah, and his coming would be heralded by a sign in the heavens. The approximate timing of this event was known from Daniel's writings, Daniel 9, and Persian records. In reading Matthew's account, something remarkable emerges. The word translated as wise men is literally and originally the word magoi, M-A-G-O-I. The head over all Persia was a monarch. At the time of Jesus' birth, it was King Phraates IV. But Persia was actually governed by the equivalent of a parliament or congress comprising two houses. This is similar to the USA today, or Britain or Australia. The entire Persian Congress or Parliament was called the Megastanes. The lower house members were the Assembly of Princes. However, the upper house members, the Senate, comprised two groups. First were the Sophoi, or wise ones. The second were the Magoi, or great ones. The title Magoi being like our word senator. In the oldest texts, Matthew records that these Magoi were the ones who came to Jesus. The Magoi were described by a prominent historian in this way.
In the 7 great monarchies of the ancient world, George Rawlinson describes the Parthian monarchy as limited. 2 councils permanently advised the king, and the men of these councils were entitled to their seats because of birth or office. One of the councils was a family conclave, or assembly of full-grown males of the royal house. The other was a synod, made up of the spiritual and temporal chiefs of the nation. These chiefs were called Saphoi, or wise men, and Magoi, or priests. The 2 councils together were called the Megastanes. The appointment of a new king could only occur with the concurrent vote of both councils. The Magoi, especially, were a powerful body and privileged class that had a great deal of influence in checking and controlling the monarchy.
Magoi was the exact word Matthew used to describe the visitors who came looking for the new king of the Jews. They were the kingmakers of their empire. Indeed, from 40 BC until 37 BC, Parthia controlled the region indicated by the blue arrows, including Jerusalem. So in the minds of the Magoi, it was possible that a king of the Jews could also become king of Parthia in an empire such as that envisioned by Daniel. Today, some Bibles translate Magoi as wise men. Others translate it as Magi, M-A-G-I, on the basis of tradition. But Matthew did not write Magi. The Magi were priests of Mithras, which was different from the state religion of Persia, Zoroastrianism. The symbol of the Mithras religion was Mithras rising out of a rock and slaying a bull. The symbol of Zoroastrianism was a winged disc representing divine royal glory. the Persian king was considered to have some of the glory imparted to him, which was the reason for the human figure in the symbol. So here is a world of contrast in the two basic symbols of the religions. There is a difference in time also. From 450 BC until 225 AD, Persia held strongly to the Zoroastrian faith. Indeed, some 250,000 people still practice it today, of which 1,000 do so in this temple in New York. Note the Zoroastrian symbol under the arrow. The interior shows no images or decorations from any Mithraic source, so one did not originate from the other. In contrast, the Mithras cult was not prominent until after the birth of Jesus. Mithras became popular from the middle of the 1st century AD up until the end of the 4th. It became centred in Rome and was followed by many Roman soldiers. For this reason, the Roman Emperor Constantine had his image and Mithraic symbols and motifs on the same coin as shown here. He favoured Mithraic precepts. The practitioners of Mithras religion were magi, and Constantine gave them validity by changing the word magoi into the word magi in the Latin Bible about 325 AD. It meant omitting only one letter, the letter O, from magoi in Matthew's account. But magi is the root word for magic and magician, which comes from their practitioner's art. In contrast, magoi is the root for major, majority, and magnificent, words which came from the Persian parliamentary office that they held. Because of Constantine's acceptance of Mithras religion, the distinction between the two different groups with similar sounding names became blurred and has given us problematic traditional translations ever since. About 535 BC, Daniel, as head of the Persian court, also prophesied as to when the King of the Jews should appear. This can be deduced from Daniel 9 and the writings. Thus the Magoi knew the approximate time of Jesus' birth. In addition, the Magoi studied astronomy. So with the religious prophecies, the writings, and the events in the sky coinciding, they made ready to leave Mesopotamia. They did not travel on camels. Camels were only used for trade and bringing war supplies. Instead, the usual means of travel was by horse. In fact, the Persians were fantastic equestrians and had some of the finest horses in the world. In war, they used two combined but different types of fighting unit acting together. First, the cataphracti were the heavy component with their metal helmets, chain mail vests, plus lance and mace as shown here. The size of all Parthian units were 111 men and horses. The cataphracti were always accompanied by a regiment of 111 highly mobile horse archers. This is how horse archers typically looked in action. They had blue tunics, short bows, and 100 arrows, plus a sword or dagger. These two units had techniques which consistently won out against the Romans. For example, when confronting each other in battle, wave after wave of Persian horse archers would come within 55 yards of the Roman legions, make a U-turn to the right, and head back into their own lines. At the point when the U-turn was made, the archers would turn around in their saddles and fire a hail of arrows at the enemy, called Parthian shots, which later became parting shots. Since the Roman javelin's maximum range was only 33 yards, the Persians were safe by a factor of 20 yards or more. If the Romans moved forward, the Parthians would melt away in front and close in on the flanks and rear. There is also a technique whereby they surrounded the whole Roman army like bees around a honey pot. Once the horse archers had finished, the cataphracti moved in. All this unnerved the Romans. They could not strike back at the Parthians, and the Romans crumbled under the attack. Rome consistently lost against the Parthians, even though the Parthians were outnumbered. In one battle, an army of 10,000 Parthian horse archers and cataphracti decimated 40,000 Romans. Now picture the situation. Here is a delegation of leading politicians, priests, scientists and kingmakers from Persia. They need to penetrate about 1,000 miles into territory controlled by Rome, with whom they are at war. The shortest route is due west across the desert, and the Magoi would have travelled on horses, but they would not go alone, nor be unprotected. In the same way the US President takes his security team with him, the Magoi would be protected by their basic security force, namely 1 unit of cataphracti and 1 unit of horse archers to meet any Roman attack. This means that 222 elite armed horsemen from a foreign power would arrive at the outskirts of Jerusalem. The scene would be something like this, which is a cavalry unit of 100 Australian light horsemen in Jerusalem in World War I. The total number of travelling Magoi is unknown. A tradition from Eastern Christianity has it that there were 12. There may have been many more, perhaps the entire upper house of the Persian Parliament. They would be accompanied by 222 horsemen, in addition to animal handlers, cooks and servants. It would have been quite an impressive entourage. It was only in the 3rd century that the idea of 3 kings emerged, and it was only later in the 5th century that they were given names. As a result, they appear on our Christmas cards. It's only tradition. It has very little to do with the truth. It was more than just 3 old men on camels. That would be an everyday event in Israel, as it was on a major trading route. Neither Herod nor Jerusalem would have been bothered by this at all. Camels imply trade and a good time, sparking a reaction similar to the people in this image. Meantime, Herod's own guard, which normally defended Jerusalem, was away fighting for Caesar in Armenia. They were warring against the wild Homonadensian tribes who had sided with the Parthians against Rome. Jerusalem was without defence except for a few mercenaries. It was into this situation that cavalry units from a foreign power approached through the outskirts of Jerusalem, just like this Australian cavalry unit did in World War I. Imagine Herod's consternation when he saw a Persian regiment arrive at the plaza in front of his palace gates. Here were over 200 crack horsemen escorting the upper division of the Persian parliament and waiting to see him in a scene something like this. The Magoi then informed Herod that they had come to worship, not just pay respects to, but worship the new king of the Jews, whose star they had seen in the dawn. That is why the Bible tells us that Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. He was confronted with an armed regiment escorting a significant political contingent. The Magoi really did cause a stir in Jerusalem. The Bible says Herod, quote, inquired diligently about when the star appeared, end quote. So an interrogation of the Magoi took place to determine this key fact. But once Herod had this vital information, he played nice with the wise men and their army. He asked them to please find the young child and report back to him so he could worship the child also. We know Herod had no intention of doing that. We know the story. The bloodbath of children under 2 years old followed. We're getting ahead of ourselves. What was the sign in the heavens that the Magoi actually saw, which induced them to come over 1,000 miles into enemy territory to see an unknown child? The question is, did anyone else see this sign in the heavens, perhaps the Romans? And when did the wise men, the Magoi, actually see the young child? We'll discuss these and other questions in part 2. We look forward to your company then. Thank you very much.